This is the Clavister S-Series Model SX40. It's a firewall appliance from the early 2000s made by the Swedish company Clavister. This isn't your average home router though. This thing is built like a tank with an all-metal enclosure and a thick aluminium front bezel. It was mainly sold to businesses as an office or server room firewall back in the day. What I find most interesting about this device though is what's inside. So let's have a look. This neat little board is actually an x86 PC sporting a VIA Eden ESP4000 processor running at 400 MHz and a Twister T graphics chip. The Eden line of processors are part of VIA's C3 lineup, but optimized for embedded use, meaning lower energy usage but also lower performance. C3, by the way, was originally meant to be named Cyrix 3, as it was based around the core designed by Cyrix, which VIA acquired in 1999. But due to performance issues, they switched the design to another one based on the WinChip processors by Centaur Technology, which VIA had also acquired in 1999. Apart from the CPU and graphics chip, the board has one SD-RAM slot, one IDE connector, one PCI connector, VGA output in the form of a small IDC connector, 4 Ethernet ports and a 12-volt barrel jack for power. I haven't been able to find much information about the board itself apart from a blog post from 2018 describing an identical board but in a different device. So I guess it's just one of those generic single board computer thingies that was used in various industrial and embedded applications back in the day. Okay, so what's the point of all this? Well, I've always found it interesting to repurpose old things and find a new use for them. Or in this case, more like an old use, because I've decided to turn this thing into a retro gaming computer. I think it's a pretty good match for the job. The components and performance are typical of a late 90s PC, and it shouldn't be too difficult to find Windows 98 drivers for most of this stuff. Although the presence of only one PCI slot will be a little bit limiting. But before I can do anything with this board, it's gonna need some repairs. As you can see here, some of the capacitors have started leaking and I will need to replace those with new ones. I also need a way to connect this thing to a monitor since it only has this IDC connector on the board, so I'm gonna have to make an adapter for that. But first, let's get those caps replaced. Okay, so that's it as far as capacitors go. So next up, I have to create an adapter for this VGA port here. Dirty. Now let's put on the IDC connector at the other end of the cable. There we have it. The VGA cable is done. Alright, let's put in a memory stick. Okay, let's hook it up. VGA, check. Okay, and power, off. Let's turn on the monitor. Okay then, moment of truth. Maybe analog. No signal. Ooh, look at that. Huh. Holy crap. I was like 50% sure that it wouldn't work and 25% sure that it would just start smoking or something. I'm really glad that the new capacitors worked out, despite me being kind of a noob at soldering and not having the greatest equipment. Now it's time to boot Windows 98 and try out some games. But first, let's connect everything. So here's actually the CF card adapter that came with the Firewall to begin with. I've just replaced the card itself with a higher capacity one and installed Windows 98. I did this by putting the card and adapter in another machine that has a CD-ROM drive and then doing a regular install using the Windows 98 install CD. I also need to put the VGA cable back in place. This is a USB front panel PCB that I had lying around. It used to sit in the front bezel of a computer case at some point. It has more connectors than this motherboard supports, but at least I can use 2 of them so that I can hook up a mouse and keyboard. Then of course, to be any useful at all for retro gaming, it's gonna need a sound card. So here's a Yamaha XG PCI card that I'm gonna use. It works well in Windows and decently for DOS games. It supports both Sound Blaster emulation and general MIDI. and it sounds quite nice. So there, everything's ready to go. And this time I've hooked it up to my IBM CRT monitor rather than that pesky old TFT flat panel that I have in my workshop. Okay, so booting into Windows 98. All drivers and stuff are already installed, so everything is ready to go. And as you can probably tell, I'm capturing the audio directly from the sound card so that you can hear what the Yamaha XG sounds like. And the first game I wanted to try is Doom 2, one of my favorite games from the 90s. I've configured it to use General MIDI for the music and Sound Blaster for digital audio. And of course, Doom runs great, as you would expect with a 400 MHz processor. And the General MIDI music sounds nice too. Next, let's try another classic DOS game, Raptor Call of the Shadows. This one's also set to use General MIDI for music and Sound Blaster for digital audio. This game runs great too, of course. I did expect most games from this era to run perfectly on this machine, but I'm glad to see that there doesn't seem to be any weird compatibility issues or stuff like that. I also wanted to try out a slightly newer game, so here's Unreal. As you can see, it runs pretty poorly, and that's largely because I couldn't get any sort of 3D acceleration to work. I thought that the Twister T chip would support at least some rudimentary 3D acceleration, since it's supposedly based on the S3 Savage 4 architecture. Not sure if it's a limitation with the hardware or if it's a driver issue or whatever. Perhaps the Twister T is just a stripped down version that only supports 2D direct draw or something. Anyway, this is kind of how I remembered playing Unreal for the first time. I think it was on a Pentium MMX 166 MHz with no 3D accelerator, so yeah, it must have run even worse than this. But I played it anyway.
Prisoner 3 escaping.
Here's another essential 90s game. Quake sits right at the edge of what this hardware can comfortably handle, I think. It runs great in software mode at the lowest resolution, but if you crank it up just a little bit to 640 by 480, then it runs just barely okay. Turning down the screen size a few steps makes it more playable in 640 by 480. Now there's one more DOS game that I wanted to try, and that's Duke Nukem 3D. I couldn't get digital audio to work with this game at all, only MIDI music. Apparently that's a known issue with the Yamaha sound cards, so it doesn't seem to be a problem with the unusual motherboard and CPU. But other than that, the game runs perfectly. So that's it. That's how you turn a 20-year-old broken and discarded Firewall into a 90s gaming machine. Albeit with a few flaws, such as extremely limited expandability and no 3D acceleration. But still, I'm happy that I could even make it work at all. It would be nice to put it in some kind of enclosure. The original Firewall case is unfortunately too slim to fit the sound card, even if I angle it at 90 degrees. But perhaps it could be modified to make it work. I'll have to see what I come up with, and maybe that journey will end up in another video. Thanks a lot for watching. This has been my very first and only YouTube video so far, but I intend to make more videos about odd and obsolete retro computer stuff, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, please do subscribe. Alright, bye bye for now.